Hello, my name is David Callett. I'm a film historian, and for the next 94 minutes, I'll be your audio guide through the world of Nosferatu. The story I have to tell you is about an ancient thing, a relic of a musty and forgotten past long since gone, that has improbably survived into the modern world. This thing was a creation of the occult, nurtured by people who sought esoteric knowledge and power. The forces of civilization rallied to destroy it, but despite their combined best efforts, it escaped and survived in the darkness to spread its influence into other countries and other times. Now, by a curious coincidence, this happens also to be the on-screen story of Nosferatu, but that's just a lucky side effect. I'm not here to talk about the plot of this movie. I'm here to tell you the weird and unexpected story behind the scenes. Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, premiered in Berlin on March 4th, 1922. It was directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, one of the rare artists of cinema whose greatness was recognized during his lifetime. Murnau rose to the very heights of the film industry in Weimar, Germany, and then came to Hollywood as a celebrated international genius. There are few superlatives that haven't been said about Murnau, and fewer still that aren't completely deserved. Although Murnau was already an up-and-coming star in German silent cinema, with 9 films to his credit before he made Nosferatu, this is one of the earliest of his films to survive. Almost the entirety of Murnau's early career has been erased from history. And so when I say that Nosferatu's survival is improbable, to some extent this is what I'm talking about. It's been estimated that no more than half of all motion pictures made before 1950 survive. For silent films, that rate drops precipitously. The estimate is maybe 20% of feature films made in the 1920s exist in complete form. One of the major culprits in this tragedy is the film stock itself. Silent films were made using silver nitrate, which produced incomparably beautiful images, but was in essence an explosive. The irony is the explosive nature of silver nitrate has obscured its beauty. Most audiences know silent films as a flickery, scratchy, doopy-looking thing because they're used to watching safety copies of the originals. But on the rare occasions you can actually see something sourced directly from the silver nitrate, it absolutely shimmers with life. Murnau's films were made for studios that went bankrupt in a country that ceased to exist during World War II. Now let's be charitable and say that silent films today have at best a niche market, and that's being unduly generous. So on every front, technical, physical, commercial, historical, every conceivable force in the world was aligned to hinder or prevent the survival of Murnau's films to the present day. But here this is, indomitable. It's a cause for celebration, for unrestrained joy. One of the pieces of Nosferatu that has improbably survived to the present day is Murnau's personal copy of the script, with his annotations made during production and post-production. Thanks to this artifact, as well as personal letters sent back and forth between Murnau's associates, we know something about where the movie was filmed. Much of it was shot on location, which was highly unusual for German film of the era, which tended to be very studio-centric. But in the summer of 1921, Murnau and his team filmed in places like Lübeck and the Baltic port of Rostock. This opening shot of the church tower overlooking the fictional town of Visburg, and most of the establishing shots of the village and its harbor that we will see throughout the film, were shot in early August 1921 in Wismar. In the fall of 1921, after the exteriors and location work was completed, Murnau brought the production team to the Jofa studios in Berlin-Johannisthal for the interior shooting. The absence of most of Murnau's previous works put scholars in an awkward bind. We can compare Nosferatu to what came later in Murnau's career, but not so well to what came before. For that, we can only speculate. And there are aspects of Nosferatu which are anomalies in the context of Murnau's career, but that missing context permits us to avoid those questions, to sweep the anomalies under the rug. For example, what we see in these opening scenes with Hutter and his wife Ellen is a pronounced romantic aesthetic. Now, I don't mean romantic in the sense of lovey-dovey and all that. If anything, the relationship between Hutter and Ellen seems more like brother and sister than husband and wife. But in terms of larger traditions, this sequence, and indeed huge swaths of this film, are aligned with the style of German Romanticism. Some shots are even conscious and deliberate evocations of German Romantic paintings by the likes of Caspar Friedrich, Ludwig Kircher, Georg Kersting, and Arnold Böcklin. The emphasis at this point is on a pastoral beauty and natural realism. But that's not what the film is remembered for. Ellen's weird goth chick response to being handed a bouquet of flowers by her sweetie, "Why'd you kill the pretty flowers?" sets an uneasy tone right away. Death hangs over this girl. It's the first hint that this movie will turn to expressionist visions too. Modern, extreme, and threatening, the emphasis will turn away from nature to artifice, from landscapes to dreamscapes, from sunlight to shadows, and a naturalistic, realistic style of acting will give way to exaggeration and stylization. And the thing is that both Romanticism and Expressionism dealt with the unnatural, but with radically different styles. And in the second half of the story, the Expressionist imagery attacks the Romantic imagery. That's part of Murnau's genius here, and crucially part of the film's enduring power and appeal. Murnau owns both of these styles and combines them in unexpected and evocative ways. This sequence at Knock's real estate concern starts to introduce the expressionist touches, thanks in part to the contributions of Albin Grau. Grau designed the sets at Yofa Studios. He also designed the costumes and drew up the promotional artwork. We can admire his witty little touches, the too-high stool, the shelves piled with paper, and this bizarre letter full of cryptic symbols. These are actually real codes, borrowed from various cryptographic schemes of different esoteric societies, and we'll be returning to Grau's esoteric connections in due course. Knock is definitely an unsettling boss. I mean, can you imagine working for this guy? He must pay really well. The actor inside the bald cap and mouthful of fake teeth is Alexander Granach. Granach went on to play numerous other roles in German cinema before fleeing the Nazis to relocate in Hollywood, where he earned a living as a minor supporting player in major movies like Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, Fritz Lang's Hangmen Also Die, Ernst Lubitsch's Ninotchka. Notably, Granach's best gigs in Hollywood came working for other German émigrés. His employee Hutter is played by Gustav von Wagenheim, who came from a family of actors. Both his mother and father were performers. Gustav had been trained by the legendary Max Reinhardt and made his first movie appearance in 1914. He worked with the greats, Murnau, of course, Fritz Lang, too. As an outspoken communist, von Wagenheim also fled the Nazis in 1933 to sequester himself in the Soviet Union for the duration of the war. He returned afterwards to East Berlin, where he became the director of the Deutsche Schauspielhaus. Both von Wagenheim and Granach were reunited the following year, along with other members of the Nosferatu production team, for the film Warning Shadows. Knock suggests that Hutter try to sell Count Orlok the property right across from Hutter's house, and we cut to a view of the place, a massive, decaying structure that looks like it was created by Albin Grau as an expressionist prop. But in fact, it's a real place, believe it or not, that was built by real people for some other purpose unrelated to vampires. And it, too, has improbably survived to the modern day. You could go there if you wanted, and it looks the same now as it does in the film, with those melty walls and droopy windows. It's a former salt warehouse in Lübeck that still looks just as decrepit and haunted as it did in 1921. Now is probably a good time to get some biographical background on Murnau. For one thing, that wasn't his name. He was born Friedrich Wilhelm Plump. And yes, that name is just as unflattering in German as it is in English. He grew up in the bucolic splendor of Westphalia, and from the start he was an imaginative dreamer of quiet demeanor and a voracious reader. He studied art history at the University of Heidelberg, and from there developed a wider interest in the arts. He took to acting, and did so under an assumed name, to avoid his father's disapproval. And it was here that he adopted the name Murnau, taken from a town of the same name. Now, the town of Murnau was situated in rural Bavaria, and was the headquarters of the artist colony Der Blaue Reiter. Friedrich Wilhelm spent some time there in the company of the likes of Vasily Kandinsky, and for the first time he felt himself at home among peers. It was in Murnau that F.W. first fell in love with the poet Hans Ehrenbaum Degeler. This place had given F.W. his identity, so it might as well have given him his name. Many commentators look back to Murnau's pastoral childhood as the source point of his career-long nostalgia for countrysides, but we can also spot there another key factor. We're not talking about a well-to-do kid here, but someone who knew the hard life, whose formative years were spent among the downtrodden. Along with the recurrent fantasy of country life, Murnau's films repeatedly echo imagery from the artists of Der Blaue Reiter, such as Gabriele Munter. As a young actor, he caught the eye of the legendary Max Reinhardt, who contracted him for a 6-year posting in Berlin. Murnau's time with Reinhardt was interrupted by World War I, during which Murnau volunteered for service, saw heavy combat, and distinguished himself on the field. He was promoted to officer and eventually became a combat pilot. He survived 8 separate plane crashes, the last of which got him interned in Switzerland for the duration of the war. It also left him with a damaged kidney, which meant he scarcely took another drop of alcohol as long as he lived. Released from Switzerland at the end of the war, he returned to Reinhardt and his blossoming career in the theater, and severed nearly all ties with his family. Save for his brother and mother, Murnau disowned the Plump clan from then on. In 1919, Murnau made his film-directing debut with The Blue Boy, based on the famous painting by Thomas Gainsborough. To inaugurate one's movie career with a movie based on, of all things, a painting, speaks volumes about Murnau's aesthetic priorities. Within just 3 years of that debut, Murnau made Nosferatu, followed not long after by The Last Laugh, and then Faust, which won him a fat Hollywood contract. In 1926, Murnau moved to America and made Sunrise, one of the first motion pictures ever awarded an Oscar. So what we have in Murnau is a once-in-a-generation talent who happens to be working in an institutional environment where the director has a substantially higher degree of authority and creative latitude than anywhere else. As a result, it's an easy trap to fall into, to think of Murnau's films as wholly auteurist creations, in which he and he alone is responsible for all the creative decisions. But thinking about Nosferatu in those terms does a disservice to this film and leads us down some false trails. Murnau is just one of several competing aesthetics at work here. A major one, to be sure, but still part of a larger dynamic, and it's in the tension between these competing and sometimes contradictory aesthetics that the film draws its curious power. Now let me map out a few of these competing aesthetics for you here. First, we have the fact that this is a movie adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'll return later to a discussion of what was going on in Bram Stoker's head and in his society at large when he wrote that book, but for now, I feel pretty comfortable that Dracula is enough of an established force in popular culture that I can just say, movie version of Dracula, and you have a working set of expectations of what that might mean. And one of those working expectations is a realization that Dracula is a work of 19th century Gothic literature by a Victorian Englishman, whereas this movie is a 20th century work of German expressionism by an artist who is principally trained as an art historian and who is associated with German Romanticism. So, the second of our key creative oppositions is the way in which Murnau, as a visual artist of the Romantic tradition, comes to this with a set of aesthetic predispositions that are fundamentally in tension with English Gothic literature. Third would be the fact that even though Murnau was a largely independent artist working in the director-friendly world of Weimar cinema, even so, there are cultural expectations built up around Weimar cinema, and he's inevitably working within that tradition. Specifically, Weimar cinema has a strong attraction to fairy tales. The Nibelungen, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Student of Prague, The Golem, Faust, Destiny, Homunculus, Alraune, Tartuffe, Waxworks, Warning Shadows. The key works of German silent film are set in fantasy lands and dreamscapes. Contemporaneous with this film was another major landmark classic of German silent cinema, Fritz Lang's Dr. Mabuse the Gambler. And the marketing for that film largely centered around one really distinctive feature. It was set in the modern day. And that by itself became a selling point within a film industry where practically everything else was set in a fairy tale past. We can see this influencing Nosferatu in that Stoker's novel was set in the same period in which it was written and received, 1890s England. Dracula is about the ancient vampire of the fairy tale past invading the modern-day present. But in this adaptation, the story has been shifted from 1890s England to 1830s Germany. It's been forcibly relocated back into that fairy tale past. And at the same time, the character names have been changed. Now, the default understanding of this, the conventional wisdom, is that screenwriter Henrik Galeen changed the names as a way of concealing the fact that this was an adaptation of Dracula to avoid having to pay any copyright license fees. This isn't the case. The opening titles clearly state that this is an adaptation of Stoker's Dracula. If you're trying to hide that fact, bluntly stating it right off the bat is a poor strategy. No source has ever actually documented that Galeen or Murnau or anyone else involved in this made that choice to change the names due to copyright considerations. Even when the Stoker estate sued for copyright infringement, it didn't come up as a defense. Instead, what we can see is that the decision to move the story to the time of the Brothers Grimm is a way of situating the film squarely in the comfort zone of audience expectations. This is a low-budget film made by Germans for German audiences, first and foremost. Setting it in Germany with German-named characters makes the story more tangible and immediate to German-speaking viewers. Now, in tracing these creative oppositions, I've been moving from the specific to the general. So we started with the literary source text. Then we had its adaptation by a particular visual artist. And then we talked about how he was working within a given cultural context. As our fourth set of creative forces informing the choices behind this film, the overall German film industry operated as an evolutionary development out of the German theater. An absolutely astounding number of German directors and actors came from the orbit of Max Reinhardt, the legendary manager of the Deutsches Theater and founder of Germany's most influential acting school. It is almost impossible to overstate the significance of Max Reinhardt as a creative force in German cinema. In no other film industry in the world will you find the entire industry so singularly indebted to the creative vision of one individual. He popularized theatrical lighting techniques that would be ported over intact into the world of film. The low-key chiaroscuro lighting that characterizes German silent film was essentially his creation. As competition from other theaters and movies encroached on his dominance of the Berlin art scene, he continued to produce important and popular plays until he left Nazi Germany in the 1930s to start over on Broadway, where he was once again a force to reckon with. He even started directing films in Hollywood. The list of luminaries who got their start with him is humbling in its scope. F.W. Murnau, Ernst Lubitsch, Otto Preminger, Paul Wegener, Paul Lenny, William Dieterle, Edgar Ulmer, as well as great German film actors such as Nosferatu's stars, Gustav von Wagenheim and Max Schreck, as well as Alfred Abel, Gustav Froelich, Pola Negri, Conrad Veidt, Theodor Loos, Emil Jannings, and that's just listing the German greats who trained under him. If you want to include Hollywood, then we'd be talking about Marlene Dietrich, Hedy Lamarr, and Clint Eastwood. But let's keep the focus on 1920s Germany for now, and note that not only did Murnau and his two stars both come directly from Reinhardt's leadership, but their peers and contemporaries did too. Reinhardt's influence spread across the totality of German cinema. On any given film, there would almost certainly be one, if not multiple, Reinhardt protégés, and those rare productions not linked directly to him were being made in a culture where Reinhardt's creative vision had become the normative one. Even apart from Reinhardt's influence, German cinema acted as if it was the theater. Movies premiered with massive opening night galas attended by VIPs. Up on the screen, techniques like iris effects were used to mimic theatrical lighting effects common on the stage, while in the theater, a live orchestra performed the score. The music we're listening to now was commissioned especially for this film by composer Hans Erdmann and was performed live by an actual orchestra. This was an event, and it wasn't unique to this little low-budget vampire movie having a full orchestra play the accompanying music by an established composer. That was the norm. That's what going to the movies in Berlin was like, and for the audience in the theater, they received printed programs like you'd get at a play, fully illustrated program notes to accompany the performance. Now, what we have in this sequence is a terrific opportunity to see the competing aesthetic forces at work. We have Stoker's source novel, which opens more or less with this set of incidents. The real estate agent arrives in the Carpathians to conduct business with the Count. The locals are full of superstitious fears and try to warn him off his mission, and as his confidence wavers, the Count shows up in his carriage to whisk him off to his castle. Then we have the initial set of filmmakers seeking to adapt this into a motion picture. Screenwriter Henrik Galeen has taken these events from Stoker's book and embellished them nicely, with additions like the peasants abandoning Hutter in the mountains, and the overtly supernatural flourish with which Orlok comes to greet him. And then you've got Murnau, alternately enticed by the natural splendor of the Carpathian setting, while also keen to indulge the opportunity for cinematic effects, resulting in one of the most famous and celebrated parts of Nosferatu. It's a riot of special effects techniques. Galeen appears to have been the one to imagine the ghostly, sped-up motion of Orlok's carriage through the woods of Vratna, and he describes the effect in the screenplay. Something comes racing up, as if moved by a hidden force and moving jerkily. Stops dead. Hutter likewise. A black carriage. No wheels? 2 black horses, their legs are invisible, covered by a black funereal cloth. Their eyes are like pointed stars, puffs of steam from their open mouths revealing white teeth. The coachman is wrapped up in black cloth, his face pale as death. His eyes are staring at Hutter. Raising his whip, he makes an inviting, almost commanding gesture. Step by step, as if pulled by invisible threads, Hutter approaches the uncanny creature and gets into the carriage. It reverses quick as lightning and dashes off, disappears. This was accomplished by having cinematographer Fritz Arno Wagner hand-cranking the camera at the wrong speed to cause a jittery, unnatural sense of motion. However, Murnau was the one who scribbled into the margins of his copy of the script that the coach would race at top speed through a white forest. To achieve this effect, they had to drape the vehicle, the horses, and Orlok in white cloth so that when the negative image was used, the background forest stayed in negative, but the carriage more or less looked unchanged. Fritz Arno Wagner had started as a newsreel cameraman for Pathé, and for all that he is associated with fantastic imagery thanks to the reputation of films like this, he was more concerned with pictorial realism. After World War II, he returned to documentary and newsreel photography, but would remain best remembered for his work here. In 1999, American cinematographers selected Nosferatu as one of the 50 best-shot films of the first half-century of film. Orlok's castle at this point is being played by Castle Półzamek in Dolny Kuban. When we first glimpsed it from afar, jutting out from the mountainside, that was Castle Orawski Zamek in Slovakia, which was built onto a hollowed-out rocky outcropping near the Orava River. And in a few minutes, we'll transition to interior scenes at Jofa Studios. There's another effect that I need to comment on, though, the color tinting. Now, this was a commonly used technique throughout the silent era, especially so in German silent film, as a way of adding visual interest to black and white images. Not only that, but there were conventions about which colors meant what. Yellow signaled exteriors, pink was used for dawn or dusk, red for firelight, and then there was blue. Film stocks in the 1920s weren't sensitive enough to be used at night, so scenes that were set at night had to be filmed in the day, but of course they'd look like daytime. So the use of blue washes was a widely accepted visual shorthand to signal to the viewer this is a night scene. Another convention that was routine to German audiences of the 1920s, but which strikes modern viewers as odd, are the clearly demarked act breaks. They aren't related in any way to the reel changes and serve no real storytelling purpose. They could be removed without damaging the flow of the film, and indeed, when shown abroad, Nosferatu and other German films usually did clip out the act break title cards. But German audiences expected them because plays were broken into acts and movies were a variation on plays. Albin Grau's credit on Nosferatu is for costumes and sets, and he's often referred to as the designer. But as we shall see, that's a gross misrepresentation. Another unhelpful description of Grau is when film historians mention Albin Grau, they almost invariably try to sum him up with a single phrase: ardent spiritualist. I can't count how many times I've seen Albin Grau called an ardent spiritualist, as if that explained anything, much less explained everything. Alright, so let's unpack this and see what we find. Throughout Europe, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were a number of spiritualist movements, each with their own unique flavor. But the guiding principle underlying all of these esoteric groups was the belief that there is substantially more to existence than rationalist scientific worldviews account for, but which conventional religions misunderstand and distort. There is a deep, secret knowledge that can render the ordinary physical world mysterious and strange, and at the same time make supernatural phenomena understandable. This is the basis of spiritualism, and the different brand names of occultism such as Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalism, and so on carve out different competing versions of this secret knowledge. Around 1920, in Berlin, there was an antiquarian bookseller with a special interest in the occult. His name was Heinrich Trenker, and he was extremely successful in selling occult and spiritualist books, so much so that he started founding various occult societies as well. After a while, he consolidated a number of these organizations into a single group, the Grand Pansophical Lodge of the Orient, Berlin. Naturally enough, he made himself Grand Master, and the secretary was another prominent occult bookseller, Eugen Grosch. The second in command of the Grand Pansophical Lodge, however, wasn't an occult bookseller. He was an aspiring designer named Albin Grau. The Pansophical Lodge boasted a membership of some 100 Germans, which made it the largest group of its kind in Germany. The group distinguished itself from other occult orders by obliging its members to undertake esoteric studies, which makes sense when you remember this was an organization run by booksellers. As members completed their required readings, they progressed through the 9 degrees of the order. This was a typical hierarchy of such groups, 9 levels through which the members could advance, but the highest level, the 10th degree, was a rare honor reserved only for the top leaders. Now, meanwhile, in addition to his involvement with the Grand Pansophical Lodge, Heinrich Trenker had a little extra something going on the side. He was recruited by the Order of the Knights of Templar of the East, also known as OTO, in May 1921. OTO named Trenker the Grand Master of Germany and awarded him the coveted status of the 10th degree. That prestige was only granted to one individual per country. For each region, there could only be one 10th degree Grand Master. So Trenker was it for Germany. His counterpart, the 10th degree Grand Master of OTO for the UK, was the infamous Aleister Crowley, the self-anointed wickedest man in the world. At the time, Crowley's works had yet to be translated into German, so Albin Grau probably knew Crowley only by reputation. Grau was a senior member of one occult order involving Trenker, and Crowley was a senior member of a different occult order involving Trenker, but their paths were destined to meet. Meanwhile, Grau had ambitions of his own. As we've seen, the leading figures in the Grand Pansophical Lodge tended to be authors and booksellers, established representatives of the old media order. But Grau saw the power of cinema and his interest in the graphic arts predated his interest in the occult. He'd studied at the Leipzig Academy of Art, and after World War I took jobs as a commercial artist until he got his foot in the door of the German film industry assisting with design work. And so it came to pass that Alban Grau decided to put his money where his mouth was, and he founded a movie company with the assistance of businessman Enrico Diekmann and some fellow Pansophical Lodge brothers whose names unfortunately have not been recorded, but we do know that he capitalized his new startup with 20,000 marks. Grau christened this company Prana Film, after the occultist journal Prana, a publication of Theosophical thinking. Since most other sources you'll encounter regarding the origins of Nosferatu will tell you that Prana Film is named for the Buddhist term prana, for the breath of life, I suppose that I ought to mention that here, but you know, it's at a one-step remove. He named it after the magazine. Immediately, Grau and his partners in Prana Film started coming up with ambitious and weird projects rooted in occult themes and other sundry oddities, things like Dreams of Hell and Devil of the Swamp. Now, we can only guess at what these might have been like because they never made it past the what-if stage, but as we can see, Grau did launch a movie. In the publication Bühne and Film from 1921, intended to promote the impending release of Nosferatu, Grau said that this film was inspired by an experience that he'd had back in 1916 during World War I. He'd been stationed at the Russian front and had found himself in Serbia with the grunt duty of delousing a village to halt the spread of typhus. While attending to this duty, to help alleviate the boredom, one of Grau's fellow soldiers started talking about vampires. You know, like you do. Well, this apparently provoked one of the old peasants who was getting shaved, and this gnarled old Serbian had a story of his own to tell. Back when he was in Romania, where they call the undead Nosferatu, his father died in a logging accident. He was buried without Christian rites, and what do you know? 4 weeks after he was put in the unconsecrated ground, the village was hit by an unexplained plague. And the villagers claimed that they had seen the dead man walking, that he'd been spotted with each of the victims before they died. The villagers decided to dig up his grave, and when they did, they found, the coffin was empty. So they put the lid back and waited until the following day, and then when they opened it a second time, they found the old man inside. His body had hardly decomposed. He looked freshly buried. That and his teeth were strangely elongated and protruding from his mouth. So they drove a stake into his heart, at which point he gasped. The Serbian peasant telling this story then produced an official document attesting that the Romanian authorities had staked and burned this body. Much of that is certainly outright bullshit. It's a story told to sell movie tickets. Grau spent more on promoting Nosferatu than he spent to make it. The soldier isn't named, nor is the Serbian peasant, and none of the many places are identified with any specificity. There's no way to verify any of this story, which includes such bizarre plot points as a Romanian peasant who now lives in Serbia, but still carries with him at all times this official document stating his father was staked as a vampire. I mean, if my dad was staked as a vampire, I'm not sure I'd be eager to tell anyone, much less make sure I had proof on me, even when I was having my head shaved to get rid of lice. But of all the ludicrous nonsense packed into Grau's anecdote, there's one part I accept, and that's the bit about digging up a corpse and finding it strangely intact, and then it groans and moves when you stake it. That sort of thing does happen. It's completely ordinary, it's not supernatural at all, but it's spooky enough that when uneducated people witness it, things like vampire myths get created. Of course a body you buried isn't as decomposed as you expect it to be. Where'd you get your expectations from? By watching bodies decompose, right? So a body left out where you can see it is going to get feasted on by bacteria and insects and whatnot and fall apart fast. The whole point of burying it is to insulate it from all those elements. Sealed in a box deep under the ground, there are fewer forces acting on it. It still decomposes, but the insides go first, decaying into gas, which cause the body to bloat and force residual bodily fluids like blood to the surface, where they leak out of the mouth. If you drive a stake into a body in this condition, it's like popping a balloon. All the gas comes rushing out, causing the body to move and make noise. Nevertheless, it's folk stories like this that kept vampire legends alive, and for occultists like Grau, who believed that mystical phenomena revealed the inadequacy of prosaic scientific materialism as a worldview, vampire myths were a rallying cry, a point around which to gather and announce, "The world is stranger than you think." Many occult societies placed Dracula high on their lists of key texts. It was a crossover event, a work of occultist ideas that broke into the mainstream. Some editions of Dracula were published with illustrations inspired by tarot cards, and the artist responsible for the Waite Smith tarot deck, Pamela Coleman Smith, illustrated Stoker's last novel, Lair of the White Worm. There's a persistent rumor that Stoker was himself an occultist and was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I won't call it an unfounded rumor because of the fact that many of Stoker's contemporaries and associates were members of that order, and he attended a meeting or two, but the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn has reportedly refuted that Stoker was ever a formal member. In any event, Grau decided that a screen adaptation of Dracula was to be his company Prana Films' debut, and he turned to Henrik Galeen to write the screenplay. Galeen is a significant figure in German silent cinema. He wrote, directed, and starred in the 1915 version of The Golem, about a creature made of clay that's brought to life through magic. He wrote Waxworks in 1924, The Student of Prague in 1926, and Alraune in 1928. All of them landmarks of German fantasy and horror cinema. Galeen was a former journalist, and like Murnau, he was a veteran of the Max Reinhardt Theater Company. In the 1930s, he fled the Nazis by relocating in England as a movie producer and made his way to the U.S. in 1933. He, too, was an occultist belonging to the Rosicrucian Society. Now, Grau also selected the director. He did so on the basis of his experience in 1920 designing publicity material for a film called Journey into the Night by an up-and-coming director named F.W. Murnau. Grau engaged Murnau to direct Nosferatu for Prana Film, and Grau assisted in the pre-production development of the visual style of the film by preparing extensive concept art, which bordered on actual storyboards. Grau's artwork was also used for publicity purposes. So, Alban Grau gets credit on the opening titles for designing the sets and costumes, which he did. But he founded the production company, initiated the project, co-financed it, commissioned the screenwriter and director, and was responsible for designing the appearance of the title vampire as well as other key visual motifs commonly attributed to Murnau. Journalists on the set described Grau and Murnau working in tight collaboration on the staging of scenes. In contemporary parlance, we'd have to call Grau the producer. That's the job he performed. As Nosferatu wrapped production, Grau's attention was sucked out of the world of fantastic cinema and into the crazy power plays of occultists. It started when Aleister Crowley seized control of OTO and revamped it to promote his own self-invented religion. Crowley wanted Tranker's endorsement. Tranker led the largest occult organization in Germany, and his endorsement would carry a lot of weight. The problem was, Tranker wasn't really sure what he was supposed to be endorsing. None of Crowley's writings had yet been translated into German. So, Crowley made his way east to meet the Pansophical Lodge and negotiate the future. Their meeting was called the Vida Conference, but you could also just call it chaos. Actually getting a chance to meet Crowley in person tended to start fights. Crowley demanded absolute fealty from Tranker, and in turn, Tranker tried to get Crowley deported. Alban Grau thought Tranker's behavior towards Crowley was ungentlemanly and inexcusable. Grau didn't side with Crowley, but he thought Tranker was in the wrong, and he asked him to resign. And that was it. When Grau broke from Tranker, the Pansophical Lodge ceased to exist. Tranker and his loyalists reformed as the Fraternitas Saturni. And even though Grau had been so publicly disloyal to Tranker, his esteem as a great occultist thinker was so high, the Fraternitas Saturni actually asked him to join them as their leader. But Grau said no. He'd had his fill of the occult scene and walked away. Legend has it that Grau was sent to a concentration camp and died in Buchenwald during World War II. That is a myth. The man who set Nosferatu in motion was as indestructible as his creation, and he lived until 1971. Even wilder myths have been told about the star of Nosferatu, Max Schreck. The fact that his name translates as Max Terror certainly helped people wrongly conclude his name was a pseudonym. And if it was a pseudonym, what did he have to hide? One story held that Max Schreck never appeared on set out of his vampire makeup, or that nobody on the crew even knew the guy's name, or that Max Schreck was actually an escaped convict who took the job in Nosferatu to hide from the law. And it was a short step from there to the silly but strangely persistent notion that Schreck was an actual vampire. It was true that during production, Murnau asked the locals in Dolny Kuban to help out with a shot. He wanted their assistance loading the prop coffins onto a barge to be taken upriver against the current. Won't that just look fantastic? And the locals took one look at Max Schreck in his Ratman makeup and then looked at the enormous pile of coffins that Murnau wanted shifted, and they said, no, we won't be doing that. The fact is, Maximilian Schreck was an actor, plain and simple. He was yet another of the countless protégés of Max Reinhardt. He did a few plays with Bertolt Brecht and even made a slapstick comedy with Brecht in 1923, Mysteries of the Barbershop, along with Karl Valentin, one of Germany's few genuine contributions to the world of slapstick comedy. He's just a guy. And if you think he was a nameless, escaped convict, then just go watch some more German silent films, and there he is, again and again. He passed away in 1936. Despite all the enthusiasm that Grau and his fellow occultists had for adapting Dracula, one thing none of them seemed to have put any thought into was whether they actually had the legal right to do what they did. They never asked the estate of Bram Stoker for permission and seemed blithely unprepared when that estate responded with entirely predictable outrage. Nosferatu opened in Berlin in March 1922 with a heavy drumbeat of publicity, thanks to Grau, determined to push this first true esoteric movie. It didn't make a lot of money, and it was having trouble finding its audience. But meanwhile, word of its premiere made its way west, where it invaded the seclusion of the widow Florence Stoker. One minute she's happily playing with kitty cats in her windowsill and pining for her lost husband, and the next, here's this hideous creature from the East invading her world and bringing nothing but pain. Outside of Dracula, none of Bram Stoker's other books were even in print anymore, and the money from Dracula was spotty and unimpressive. But there were people who thought Dracula could be adapted into other media, such as the stage, and they were prepared to license those rights so long as Florence could claim ownership of them and police their use. Unauthorized use of Dracula threatened her livelihood, and she wasn't going to take that without a fight. In April 1922, the British Incorporated Society of Authors approached Florence Stoker and asked if she'd like to become a member. She immediately accepted, paid her nominal dues, and then presented herself to the Society's representative, the wonderfully named G. Herbert Thring, to tell him that she was the victim of copyright infringement in Germany by a movie company called Prana Film, whoever they were. As Thring soon discovered, Prana Film wasn't anybody, really, not anymore. Like the death ship floating into Visburg Harbor bringing only pestilence, the release of Nosferatu into theaters was no more profitable than unleashing a horde of plague rats. The company was in bankruptcy, and the subject of punishing PR for their failure to pay their bills. Thring could tell this was a dog of a case. Motion picture copyright law was still in its infancy, and case law wasn't clearly established, certainly not for cross-border disputes of this sort. To have the opposing party be a bankrupt entity didn't help, and it irked him, as well as the rest of the society, that Florence had only joined the society when she was already in trouble, and now expected extraordinary international legal efforts on her behalf, at the expense of members who duly paid their fees for years and years and never asked for anything. But saying no to Florence Stoker wasn't easy. She was a force of nature. Like Ellen in the movie, Florence Stoker was an indomitable sort of woman. Even when she was down, she was winning. So Thring acquiesced and agreed to ask the Society's German lawyer, Dr. Wronker-Flathoff of Berlin, to make a formal complaint at Pronafilm and see what happened. And by the way, G. Herbert Thring and Dr. Wronker-Flathoff, I mean, seriously, folks, you can't make this stuff up. By June, it was clear that Wronker-Flathoff wasn't going to be getting any money out of the carcass of Pronafilm, and the Society wanted to call it a day and go home. But Florence kept badgering them. In the letters back and forth, Thring keeps vowing to quit, and then keeps soldiering on in Stoker's service like her own personal Canuck. What was already an expensive endeavor for the Society just kept snowballing, and the successful prosecution of the case wasn't likely to bring any money back to the Society's coffers, nor was Florence paying for any of this beyond her nominal annual dues. Suddenly, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The Germans made a settlement offer. Actual cash money, on the condition that they were allowed to use the title Dracula and all the original character names when the film opened in the UK and America. Florence wasn't keen on this settlement. She had hopes to sell the film rights herself and dreamed of a bigger license fee than the Germans were offering. If Nosferatu opened in America under the name Dracula, she could kiss any movie deal goodbye. Also, Germany's economy in 1922 was in such a free fall that being paid in German marks was a bit like being paid in monopoly money. It's only worth something inside the game. Eventually, Prana's bankruptcy was disposed in court, but the receivers refused to pay anything to Stoker and instead appealed the decision. This was July 1923, and it would take another couple of years for the appeal to wend its way through court, and when the appellate court ruled in Stoker's favor in February 1925, Prana's receivers went and appealed that ruling. It was July 20th, 1925, 3 years after Stoker first raised her objection, that Prana's last appeal ended. All prints of Nosferatu were to be destroyed. Florence Stoker had won. And as the Society leaves started to turn later that year, she was invited to join another society. This time the Film Society of London, whose august membership boasted the likes of Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Julian Huxley, and so on. And guess what they were planning to show for their members? Just guess. But it gets worse. Not only were they going to show Nosferatu, which wasn't even supposed to exist anymore, but it wasn't called that anymore. The print they had was titled Dracula. Remember when Prana had offered a settlement in exchange for the rights to use the book's title and character names? Well, they'd gone ahead and changed the title cards after all. Florence immediately went back into battle mode and sucked poor old Thring back into the case he thought he'd finally escaped. They started pummeling the Film Society with threatening letters, but the Film Society stood their ground. Their organizer, Ivor Montagu, was a pioneering film preservationist who would later work for Alfred Hitchcock on the post-production team of The Lodger and go on to be the producer of several of Hitchcock's British thrillers. Montagu argued that the Society was a private club whose screenings were not open to the public and not commercial in motive. They had a legal right to show whatever film they wanted, and copyright law didn't enter into it. If Florence had a complaint against the makers of the film, that was a separate matter that had no bearing on the Society's ability to screen it. But Florence wasn't thinking about shutting down one piddly little screening for a bunch of London hoity-toits. She wanted the bigger prize. Find out how this copy even got into Montagu's hands in the first place, and then go try to shut that source down. Well, it turned out that Montagu had gotten it for free from a company called Sargent's Trust Limited, which was apparently desperate to unload the print because they had been unable to clear the censorship board. Which is a funny irony in that Stoker was trying to prevent the screening of a movie that had already been banned. In any event, the so-called Sargent's Trust Limited appeared to be a shell company, and its sole unnamed representative had now gone missing. And if that doesn't sound like Renfield working to infiltrate Dracula into London society, I don't know what does. And that was that. Florence Stoker had taken the makers of Nosferatu to court multiple times, and won in every single instance. She had court orders mandating the destruction of the film. The law was on her side, but the thing kept slipping through the cracks. Nosferatu had already been sold abroad to multiple countries, which would mean that in order to suppress the film, you'd effectively have to pursue legal action in each of those countries separately. In Germany, you could go after the named creators of the film, but to go after the film anywhere else, you'd be chasing shadows. Ephemeral, fly-by-night companies like Sargent's Trust and their ilk, seeded randomly around the world. It was a hopeless battle. For the scenes of Ellen looking forlornly out to sea, Murnau consciously modeled the compositions on works by Caspar David Friedrich. Other scenes in the film were inspired by paintings as well. Ludwig Kircher's The Red Tower and Halle provided the basis for the opening shot of the church tower. Georg Kersting's The Elegant Reader provided the basis for the scene of Ellen's first sleepwalking experience. Arnold Böcklin's Isle of the Dead inspired the shot of Orlok crossing the river to his salt warehouse mansion. And the image of Orlok drinking Ellen's blood in the climax of the film is based on Johann Heinrich Fuseli's painting The Nightmare. The actress playing the girl Annie isn't an actress at all. Her name was Ruth Landshoff, and Murnau spotted her one day and thought she looked just like a figure out of a painting by romantic artist Friedrich Kaulbach. And since his goal was to make the Wisburg scenes as romantic as possible, this girl seemed perfect. Murnau had to negotiate with her mother to get permission to use Ruth on the film when she was out of school. The actress playing Ellen is Greta Schroeder. She'd worked with Murnau previously on a film called The Smuggler's Madonna from 1920. That's one of those early Murnau works now believed lost. She also appeared in the 1920 film version of The Golem, directed by her one-time husband Paul Wegener and written by Henrik Galeen. This hauntingly beautiful beachside graveyard where she does her grim staring routine was filmed at List on Silt in late summer 1921. There are 110 text inserts throughout this film. Those are act break cards, coded letters, journal entries, and traditional silent movie intertitle cards. It's a pace of over 1 per minute, which is fairly high and out of sync with what you might expect. In one of his earlier films, Schloss Vogelud, also known as The Haunted Castle, one of the first things F.W. Murnau did on the project was to reduce the number of intertitles by half. Famously, Murnau made The Last Laugh with practically no intertitles at all, save for one lone outlier in the final act. There's another German silent classic that got away with using absolutely no intertitles whatsoever, and that was Alban Grau's Warning Shadows. So, if both Murnau and Grau were inclined to dial back on the use of intertitles, why so many here? Why is so much of the running time of the film given over to them? Well, the simple answer is that this is an adaptation of a book, and it's not just any book, but a book that was itself presented as a collection of letters and documents. The story of Dracula is not told by any single narrator, but rather emerges out of the separately told experiences of multiple narrators as the story switches back and forth between their discrete points of view. It's been noted that Nosferatu is also presented as a collection of documents, but generally the effect is different. The journal entries are not identified as coming from different points of view. It is, however, in the visualization of the film that we get a collage of disparate narrative perspectives. This sequence in particular is a brilliant use of montage to smash different parts of the story together and create anxiety out of their juxtapositions. As a cinema artist, Murnau is mostly thought of in terms of pictorial artistry, his sense of compositions, his evocation of great paintings, his use of the fluid camera. Murnau's use of montage is not written about quite as much, unfortunately. Now, there are 3 things that editing can do for you. One is the simple, prosaic task of splicing together different takes because you can't fit 94 minutes of film into the camera in one go. Now that HD video has taken over celluloid film, you could, in theory, have a 94-minute long film made out of a single take, but that would be an anomaly, because there are much more interesting things montage can do, such as establish rhythm. The film has suddenly picked up pace substantially. The journey from the Carpathian Mountains back to Visborg probably takes weeks at least, but it's presented here as a breathless chase, and the tension mounts palpably. Montage also creates meaning out of the juxtapositioning of different images. Ellen waiting by the sea for her lost love. Something coming by sea, but it's the vampire and his rats. Hutter is sick, trying to return to Ellen. Plague. In the juxtapositions, we're getting secret knowledge, information that's being conveyed without being stated explicitly. A sickness is coming, but is its carrier the vampire or Hutter? Ellen's love is coming, but is it the vampire or Hutter? The montage is creating ambiguities. The Demeter is the one name in the film that hasn't been transformed from the novel. That's also what the ship in Dracula was called. The name is a reference to Greek mythology, Demeter being the goddess of the fertility of the earth. The irony here is that the earth in question on this ship is fertile only with disease. Murnau was an avid outdoorsman. I mean, that much should be evident from a man who named himself after a camping ground. While filming in the High Tatras, he enjoyed hiking and mountain climbing with the crew. It was already rare for a German film crew to go traipsing around such places, instead of mocking up elaborate outdoorsy stages inside the studio. But Murnau was not interested in having a model ship float around some indoor tank. He took the crew out on a real schooner on the real sea, and there he discovered he absolutely loved yachting. Murnau went on a yachting trip with Walter Spies shortly thereafter. Spies was the one who then introduced Murnau to composer Hans Erdmann, the musical director of the Jena Theater from 1919 to 1920, who later wrote several motion picture scores, including the music for Fritz Lang's 1932 classic, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. Erdmann published the Nosferatu score under the title Fantastisch Romantisch, which was presented in two arrangements, one for a full orchestra and one for a smaller group. It was comprised of 10 pieces, which were called idyllic, lyrical, ghostly, stormy, destroyed, strange, grotesque, unchained, and distraught. It's almost like Erdmann was trying to write blurbs for the trailer. The interiors of the ship were not filmed on location. These are Grauens sets at the Jofa Studios. Murnau's films are often remarked on for his use of depth of field, low canted angles, and diagonal shapes bisecting the screen. He's got that stuff going on in spades here. The cinematography is boxing these desperate characters in. They're trapped, and the staging makes visual what is true narratively. Suddenly night falls, or should I say blue falls, and the fertility of this earth reveals itself. The vampire intrudes into the frame via a special effect. This is something else for which Murnau is known, violating the integrity of the frame and violating spatial continuity. And what could violate the integrity of the frame more but for a character to enter the frame space without moving and without a cut? Double exposure effects of the same kind had been used to create images of ghosts in the 1920 film The Phantom Carriage by director Victor Sjöström. Murnau was very impressed by that film and keen to port those touches over to his own work. Meanwhile, the editing is continuing to build to a crescendo. By cross-cutting the shots of Hutter racing frantically to return to Visborg, with the scene about the ship's first mate's heroic resolve to go below decks and confront whatever is down there, Murnau gives us a tentative sense of hope. Maybe Hutter will get back to Visborg before the vampire and warn everybody. Maybe the Demeter's surviving crew can stake the damn thing. The forces of good are rallying to meet the challenge. A few minutes ago, montage was being used to generate anxiety and ambiguity. Now it's being used to inspire a moment of hope, and in just a few more seconds, he'll yank that hope away. Nosferatu. That is such a wonderfully evocative word. It's possibly the most perfect example of onomatopoeia ever devised. In English, there are associations to feral animals, Lucifer, asphyxiation. In French, the word Nosferatu comes disquietingly close to sounding like "we will consume you." In German, there are connotations of earth and rats. It's almost too good to be true. Well, is it? In his promotional short story about the Romanian vampire, Alban Grau claimed that Nosferatu was the Romanian word for vampire, and it seems most commentary on the film has unquestioningly repeated this claim. And there's a second origin story that also gets cited frequently, that the word Nosferatu derives from the Greek nosophorus, for plague carrier. Bizarrely, some sources even manage to cite both of these claims at the same time, as if it makes any sense for a Greek word for plague carrier to inspire a Romanian word for vampire, or vice versa. There's no linguistic connection between Greek and Romanian, and no conceptual link between plagues and vampires, except in this film. It isn't part of the vampire myth generally, or the Dracula legend specifically. The fact is, Nosferatu isn't a Romanian word at all. It's a made-upian word. And if you say Nosophorus to a Greek speaker, they're just going to stare at you blankly. It isn't a recognizable word in common usage. Now, that being said, the film's uncanny linkage between vampire lore and plague metaphors is an extraordinary embellishment. Grau's design for the vampire as a man-sized humanoid rat is the most powerful visual idea in the whole film, and the swarms of rats that emerge from the coffins are truly unsettling. Murnau had wanted to unleash hundreds of rats, but that turned out to be logistically impossible, so he had to content himself with a mere handful, which he filmed so carefully that they appear to be more numerous. When Werner Herzog directed the 1979 remake of Nosferatu, he did have access to hundreds of rats, but the effect was no more memorable. The whole plague metaphor needs some context for today's viewer to fully grasp. World War I was a 4-year-long experience that killed around 10 million people, mostly young men slaughtered in combat. The technology of war had developed to the point where not only did the war slaughter 10 million in horrible ways, but modern medical science was good enough to spare the lives of many injured soldiers who'd been disfigured in combat, neurologically damaged by exposure to gas, or traumatized by PTSD. David J. Schall has written very eloquently on the idea that World War I loosed back into society huge numbers of the walking dead. People who would have died from their injuries in any other age, but were now able to return to society thanks to the work of mad scientists, their bodies and souls damaged but still ticking. In Schall's formulation, it's completely understandable that popular culture after the First World War would respond with monster movies. Germany got there first with the fairy tales we talked about before, and Hollywood followed suit about a decade behind with Dracula, and Frankenstein, and a cycle of gothic horror pictures. But to talk about the rise of 1920s and 30s horror cinema as a response to the horror of World War I is incomplete. There's another piece of this puzzle, and Nosferatu's emphasis on plagues helps us find it. As the war started to wind down in 1918, Europe and the rest of the world convulsed in the grip of an influenza pandemic that raged through 1919. More civilians died as a result of the flu than from the war. More people died from the flu than had been killed by the Black Death. Over a third of the planet was infected. 5% of the world's population died in a single year. And let's talk about who those people were who died, because you might expect that it would be the old, the sick, the weak, the typical victims of the flu. No, this flu was weird. It was some kind of perverse punishment from God. You see, this flu went after otherwise healthy young people, and it killed them. It had an especial affinity for pregnant women. The women who survived childbirth, well, they lost their babies. After a war that nearly erased an entire generation of young men, to have a disease that wiped out a generation of young women and their children, it was easy to slip into superstition, to think this plague was indeed some kind of curse. And perhaps the most dangerous disease vector back in the 19-teens came from inadequate health standards in foreign lands that could let infected crews or cargo enter otherwise healthy ports. That this practical fact abutted existing paranoia about immigration only led to greater suspicion of what sort of dangers might roll into town on the next boat. These are the thoughts rolling around the minds of viewers in 1922 as they watched the Demeter glide into port, one of the most haunting images in a film ripe with haunting images. The flu killed suddenly. Many people died within hours of realizing they were sick. A few managed to make it a few days between onset of symptoms and death. And during the pandemic, the bodies of the dead had to be steam shoveled into mass graves because there were too many of them, and the gravediggers too sick to keep up. And what was that folk story about what happens when you bury the dead improperly? Nosferatu is a vampire movie that's really about the flu. It borrows the structure of Bram Stoker's book and some outlandish imagery to disguise a story that deals with the most apocalyptic real-world event in the audience's living experience. And the thing is, such a story had to be disguised because the censors wouldn't have let it out any other way. Fear of what news of the plague would do to wartime morale inspired strict censorship. So the facts of what was happening in places like Germany and France and the US went unreported at the time. Since Spain wasn't a participant in the war, what little news coverage of the flu there was happened to cover the flu in Spain, leading to a distorted impression that the problem was somehow stronger or more localized in Spain, and hence the colloquialism, the Spanish flu. Now, here's a question for you. Who wrote these journal entries that keep interrupting the film? The author is strangely well informed about events that don't appear to have been witnessed by third parties. Not only does the writer seem to understand secrets of the vampire, such as why they travel with coffins, the journal also describes how phantoms came to greet Hutter in the Carpathian Mountains, how Ellen's soul hears the call of the vampire. I mean, when you actually stop to think about it, the only narrative perspective within the story that actually knows all of these various details firsthand is Orlok himself. That's probably not what was intended, but I do like the perversity of the idea. Nosferatu premiered in the United States in 1929, 7 years late. It had absolutely no institutional support by that point. It was basically being dumped on the market by an indifferent distributor. During its brief and ignominious run in 1929, Nosferatu got poor reviews in the US and wasn't generally received as a Murnau film. Murnau had made his big international splash with Faust in 1926, been scooped up by Fox to come to Hollywood to make Sunrise in 1927, and by 1929 Murnau was making City Girl and The Four Devils. Nosferatu was old news. From what I've read, the US print was like the UK one, titled Dracula and using the original character names. Universal was then in negotiations with Florence Stoker for the movie rights to Dracula, and they didn't want a competing version out in the marketplace any more than she did. So they bought out the US distributor of Nosferatu in order to take the film out of circulation. And guess how much they paid to buy the film outright? All of $400. Once the film was in Universal's hands, it seems the production team on the 1931 Dracula took a careful review of it because there are several moments in Todd Browning's film that mimic scenes in Murnau's, especially in the opening reel. But that's speculation. What we know for certain is that Universal cut Nosferatu up to splice bits into the comedy short Boo, in a way not wholly dissimilar to the way the makers of SpongeBob SquarePants spliced bits of Nosferatu into a kid's cartoon in the 2002 episode The Graveyard Shift. For a German silent film that was supposed to have been suppressed and destroyed, Nosferatu has had a broad and impressive reach. Back in 1922, German critics fell over themselves to gush with praise. Der Film called it a masterstroke, Lichtbildbühne called it a masterpiece, Bela Balasch said the film, quote, conveyed glacial drafts of air from the beyond. Which I guess that's praise. Meanwhile, over in Paris, composer Aaron Copland saw Nosferatu when it opened there. At the time, he was on the hunt for material for a ballet he was composing with Nadia Boulanger. Copland was energized by what he saw on screen and started adapting Nosferatu into his ballet, which he initially called La Necromancienne, and then decided to call Grog. He adapted it freely, perhaps even more freely than Galeen had adapted Stoker's novel, and although Grog was never staged in its original form, Copland cannibalized its music into later works like his Dance Symphony. Jack Kerouac wrote an essay on Nosferatu in 1960, which amounted to basically a recap of the film's plot told in Kerouac's inimitable style. In 1979, Tobe Hooper's adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot realized its vampires as basically cousins of Max Schreck's Nosferatu with bald heads and rat teeth. Also, in 1979, German filmmaker Werner Herzog mounted a remake of Nosferatu starring Klaus Kinski as the vampire. Kinski later reprised his role in a 1988 sequel, Vampire in Venice. Tim Burton named one of his villains in Batman Returns after Max Schreck, and in 2000, the film Shadow of the Vampire was a fictionalized retelling of the making of Nosferatu that took as its premise the absurd myth that Max Schreck was an actual vampire. But of all the homages to Nosferatu over the years, one of the most puzzling was the 1929 feature The 12th Hour, A Night of Horrors, attributed to Dr. Valdemar Roget. This alternate cut of Nosferatu had a substantial amount of additional footage not filmed by Murnau, and also used some footage that clearly was shot by Murnau but hadn't been seen in the original cut. The receivers of Prana Films' decrepit assets had been keen to squeeze as much value as possible out of what they had, and so they ignored the edict to destroy all Nosferatu-related footage. Instead, they sold it to a company called Deutsche Film Production, who reassembled it with newly shot material featuring actor Hans Behal and reorganized scenes so as to provide a happy ending where Ellen and Hutter survive the vampire's attack and live happily ever after. The authorities are tentatively exploring the death ship and piecing together its mysteries. Here's a deserted vessel that floated into port containing only rats. From the fragmentary evidence at hand and the increasingly upsetting entries in the ship's log, they deduce what has happened and are terrified by the realization. We in the audience already know what has transpired, but even so, we can feel the second-hand tension in a sequence so carefully crafted. This same approach, where the characters explore the ruins of a previous catastrophe as a way of discovering what sort of predicament they find themselves, would be used in later films like John Carpenter's The Thing, Ishiro Honda's Matango, Ridley Scott's Alien, and so on. Murnau's use of that structure here benefits from being embedded late in the film, with the audience already clued in. Not only do we get the vicarious thrill of watching these officials gradually realize they're on a plague ship, but the suspense is amplified because we know they are wasting precious time. While they dodder about here, Nosferatu has all that much more time to get established in the salt warehouse next to the Hutters and start marking his victims. Except, it almost doesn't matter. These officials are so useless, they never do anything helpful anyway. They can't be said to be wasting time if they aren't going to take any action no matter what. Professor Bulwer is played by Austrian character actor John Gottot. He was, as you probably guessed, a Max Reinhardt protege who worked at the Deutsches Theater as both an actor and a director. He was also brother-in-law to Henrik Galeen, and so naturally ended up making several movies with Galeen. In her book, The Haunted Screen, Lottie Eisner described Gottot as Hoffman-esque and said he seemed admirably suited to the cinema right from his first appearance as the star of Paul Wegener's 1913 version of The Student of Prague. Gottot had quite a career appearing in Germany's many fantasy and horror films of the 1920s. In addition to The Student of Prague, he also graced F.W. Murnau's now-lost 1920 film, The Hunchback and the Dancer, Robert Wien's vampire film Genuine, Paul Lenny's Waxworks, something called Algol, Tragedy of Power, which is said to be one of Germany's first science fiction films, and his final movie was in the 1932 Edgar Allan Poe omnibus, The Living Dead. And see, 1932 was when the Nazis came to power, and since Gottot was a Jew, he was suddenly banned from working. He didn't flee right away, as many of his contemporaries did, but made his way to Poland a few years later. I wish I could tell you he too improbably survived the coming horror and lived happily ever after in the US or something, but the sad fact is, in 1942, he was killed by the SS. Harsh, angular shadows cutting like teeth into a twisted path that wends into infinity, every line of perspective pointing to a tiny figure trying to warn the world. This is the moment where the expressionist imagery attacks the romantic. We've seen this village before. These shots and the other scenes of the winding alleys of Wisborg were filmed in Lübeck, the same place where the opening scenes of the film were shot. The same village can be either a romantic vista or an expressionist nightmare. So let's talk about that for a bit. Romanticism is linked to expressionism in terms of art history. German Romanticism was an art movement in the late 18th century that focused on man's relationship to God, and it tended to veer into the realms of fantasy and the uncanny as a consequence. German Romantic paintings depict forlorn figures dwarfed by wild and unfriendly landscapes. Expressionism took this existing tradition and allowed the landscapes to disconnect from reality and move into unrealistic dimensions, but still focused on depicting human alienation. Put simply, expressionism is the idea that a character's interior mental state will leak out of their body and distort the environment around them. The classic example of expressionism in movies is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which featured insane characters scrambling across equally insane landscapes. In order to achieve such effects, expressionist designers tended to work in the studio where the sets could be constructed to order to suit the design purpose. It's much harder to do this on location because the settings are what they are, and it's therefore up to the cinematographer to employ camera position and lighting to create the expressionist effects. It is therefore thanks to the careful eye of cinematographer Fritz Arno Wagner that the same physical reality could be photographed in either a romantic or an expressionist style. Wagner was arguably the preeminent photographer of Weimar cinema. His credits include several of Murnau's works, including Schloss Vogelöd, The Haunted Castle, as well as The Burning Soil, some key Fritz Lang works such as Destiny, Spies, M, and The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, and some works by G.W. Pabst, including Diary of a Lost Girl and Threepenny Opera. All of these films are marked by that sense of alienation in a hostile world, an engagement with a documentary-style realism that also functions as stylized expressionism. But those other films are notable for their use of controlled studio locations. There's something especially thrilling about the way he manipulates found reality in this film. As I already mentioned, the relationship between Hutter and Ellen isn't depicted in a very intimate fashion. It's a weirdly chaste relationship. The finale of the film strongly implies that Ellen is a woman without sin, that is to say, a virgin, which is an atypical condition for a happily married woman. And there are plenty of theories as to why the filmmakers set up the story this way. For example, we could point our accusing fingers at Alban Grau. His follow-up film, Warning Shadows, is a horror story specifically about the nightmare of female sexuality. The attitude behind Warning Shadows would be consistent with the idea that a good girl would have to be a virgin and that her acquiescence to sex would bring nothing but ruin to all involved. But it's hard to say how much of that aspect of Warning Shadows should be pinned on Grau as opposed to screenwriters Rudolf Scheiner or Arthur Robeson. Perhaps more conspicuously, we can look at F.W. Murnau. Throughout Murnau's films, he repeatedly returns to the motif of a heterosexual couple threatened by a predatory intruder. This motif informs early works like Journey into the Night, to mid-period classics Tartuffe and Faust, to his American films Sunrise, City Girl, and his final work Taboo. Even if we don't exclusively credit Murnau with inserting this theme into Nosferatu, we can see how its presence here would appeal to him. But there is another creative force involved in this movie who may be relevant in terms of understanding why this story is about two men, one weak and ineffectual, one otherworldly and dangerous, in competition for an aloof, cold, and sexless woman. Phrased in those words, what we've just done is describe the personal life of Bram Stoker. In Stoker's case, the aloof, cold, and sexless woman was Florence Balcombe. We've already encountered her steely resolve in another context, but back in the prime of her youth, no less a luminary than George du Maurier called her one of the 3 most beautiful women in the world. She was also courted by Oscar Wilde, but she ended up marrying Bram Stoker in 1878. As David J. Schall pithily noted, Florence caught the fancy of the creators of Svengali, Dorian Gray, and Dracula, which I think tells you a lot about the sort of woman Florence was. Now, this was Victorian England, as absurdly anti-sex a society as has ever lived. It's a wonder the Victorians didn't just go extinct from failure to procreate. But even by Victorian standards, Florence was cold. After giving birth to their son Noel, Florence essentially cut Bram off from her bed, and then she was a cold and distant mother to Noel. The national humor magazine Punch made fun of her with a cartoon depicting her and Noel in which she chastises him, "Little boys should be seen and not heard," to which he replies, "Yes, mother, but you never look at me." Now, that cartoon was published in 1886. That's 11 years before Dracula was published. In other words, 11 years before any notoriety or fame that Dracula might have brought to the Stokers, her frostiness was enough of a public matter that a national humor magazine figured it was fodder for a joke. Bram Stoker's sexless marriage to Florence wasn't the only personal relationship that informed his development of Dracula. We also need to talk about the famous actor Henry Irving. For almost 30 years, Bram was a close friend, confidant, and professional manager to Irving. The bond with Irving was arguably more meaningful than his marriage to Florence. Bram skipped out on his honeymoon to attend to Irving's business, and wrote letters to Irving saying things like, "Soul had looked into soul. From that hour began a friendship as profound, as close as can be between 2 men." There is a school of thought that Bram's relationship with Irving was purely mercenary. Stoker loved the theater, and through Irving had found a way to achieve high status and a stable income in that world, which then served as a support system as he launched his literary career. But then again, Irving wasn't the first guy to receive breathless letters from Bram Stoker. Earlier in his life, Stoker had written similar stuff to Walt Whitman. "How sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eyes and a child's wishes to feel he can speak so to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul." Stoker's very first letter to Walt Whitman went on for some 2,000 words and included a complete physical description. "I am 6 feet 2 inches high and 12 stone weight naked, and used to be 41 or 42 inches round the chest. I have a big mouth and thick lips, sensitive nostrils, a snub nose, and straight hair." He closed the letter saying, "I have been more candid with you, have said more about myself to you than I have ever said to anyone before. You will not laugh at me for writing this to you. It was with no small effort that I began to write, and I feel reluctant to stop." Stoker went on to write gender-bending fiction, full of men who become women, women who pretend to be men, and of course the androgynous Dracula, who sucks on both men and women alike. In one famous scene in Dracula, the vampire slices open his nipple and breastfeeds an adult woman with his blood. That Dracula is meant to be read as a vaguely autobiographical fever dream is signaled by the fact that Stoker's contemporaries recognized the character of Dracula as a thinly disguised representation of Henry Irving. Then, just a couple of years after Dracula was published, Stoker's former rival for Florence's affections, such as they were, was put on trial for sexual crimes. We're talking about Oscar Wilde, tried and sentenced for homosexuality. Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker were peers. They had both idolized Walt Whitman. They had both admired Henry Irving. They had both written landmarks of horror fiction. And they had both pursued Florence. Only now, Oscar was singled out as a monster and sentenced to 2 years hard labor, an especially cruel punishment for a soft and sensitive artist. So this is what was going on around the man who created Dracula, a man whose life was dominated with sexual anxiety. He created a work of enduring power and popular appeal by transforming that anxiety into extravagant fiction. Like an occultist using secret codes to encrypt a message, he coded the various apprehensions and fears that attended his private feelings and sexual relationships into symbols that could either be appreciated for their strange surface attributes or could be interpreted by those with access to the codebook. As originally written by Bram Stoker, the female character, called Mina instead of Ellen, is a damsel in distress caught between the predatory intentions of the vampire and the ineffectual heroics of her husband. The person who saves the day is Professor Van Helsing, a heroic scientist who understands the occult and the paranormal, yet can rally the resources of the physical world to oppose those demons. Van Helsing is the kind of man Alban Grau probably wanted to be. As adapted into the screenplay by Henrik Galeen, the Van Helsing character, renamed Professor Bulwer, was reduced in importance. In Galeen's script, there's this farrago of activity around the townspeople chasing Knock, a precursor to all those iconic scenes of angry mobs with pitchforks from the Gothic horror films of the 1930s. And it's during this commotion that Orlok makes his play for Ellen. Meanwhile, Hooder has sought out the help of vampire specialist Bulwer, but they arrive too late to save her. Instead, the vampire has perished before they even get there. In Galeen's script, Ellen is just a passive victim. The vampire feasts on her all night and ends up destroyed by the sunrise by accident. A sort of King Kong-y beauty killed the beast act of hubris. Now, to be honest, enough of that remains in the film that you could interpret the death of Count Orlok as his own inability to keep track of time. The vampire dies because he fails to wear a watch. But most viewers, and myself included, have seen Ellen's death as an act of deliberate self-sacrifice. And this is entirely thanks to F.W. Murnau, who embellished this climactic sequence with all of the key scenes establishing Ellen's conscious agency. She senses Orlok's presence. She sends Hooder out to see Bulwer as a ruse to get him out of the house. She opens the shutters and attracts Orlok's attention. She nervously awaits his arrival. Ellen's the heroine of the story only because of what Murnau added. From the moment Orlok's eyes locked on Ellen's pretty neck and he decided to buy the house across from her, this story has been about the three of them. All the other Visborgians who die are just collateral damage in the story about these three people. If anything, you could say that Bram Stoker is the one who got it wrong by inserting Van Helsing into the mix. But it's my contention that Stoker's own Victorian-addled sexual confusion probably made it hard for him to comfortably identify who any of these characters could resolve their conflict alone. So he invents this figure of authority who can come in and say, there, everything's going to be okay, these strange problems aren't your fault, and you can't be expected to solve this on your own. For their part, occultists Alban Grau and Henrik Galeen were likely to be more focused on the idea that the world is full of strange things that ordinary people can't tame. It's actually surprising they didn't keep the Van Helsing character intact when they prepared the adaptation. But perhaps the grim mood of Weimar Germany argued against a happy ending, where the forces of rationality triumph over the monsters. In any event, it surprises me not at all that Murnau changed it. Not only was he a keen dramatist who understood that the correct dramatic resolution of this twisted love triangle would need to come from within, not without, but this is basically straight out of the Murnau playbook. I mentioned before that Murnau repeatedly made movies about lovers threatened by predatory outsiders, and time and again the couple defies that intruder and comes out stronger. See Journey into the Night, Tartuffe, Sunrise, City Girl, Taboo. Remember at the top of the film, the opening title card said that this movie would explore the onset and sudden end of this plague? Well, the flu pandemic of 1918 also stopped suddenly, and in fact, no one's entirely sure why it stopped. One theory holds that the flu bug eventually mutated into a less lethal strain all on its own. Another theory suggests that doctors just got better at diagnosing, isolating, and treating the flu and managed to keep it at bay. There's no single consensus answer, but I've never read any theory suggesting that the flu was stopped when a woman who was without sin stayed up all night seducing it to death. But, who knows? So, yes, I'm equating a vampire's bite with sexual activity. Of course I am. If you don't agree, if you don't see any sexual connotation in a man who steals into a woman's bedroom while her husband is away so he can penetrate her flesh and exchange bodily fluids, good on you. But you're choosing to cut yourself off from all the most interesting subtexts in vampire fiction. Ellen's sacrifice has obviously been a locus for critical attention and competing analysis. The whole thing is so oversignified, it can almost be read in any possible way. Meanwhile, the Bulwer on screen comes across as an ineffectual boob, transformed from a potential vampire fighter into an utter loser who just stands around looking foolish while the Hausfrau gets all the real work done. Which brings us to Siegfried Kracauer. His massively influential book From Caligari to Hitler starts with the eminently reasonable thesis that the large-scale cultural undercurrents that give rise to the major events of history will also be evident ahead of time in popular culture. And since the major historical event in Germany in the 1930s was the rise of Adolf Hitler, Krakauer's theory was that the pop culture of the Weimar era that led up to the Nazi era would itself be ripe with depictions of pre-Hitlerian tyrants. And if Krakauer tries too hard to read every single film of the era with this one monolithic interpretation, it has to be said that the abundance of German horror stories in the 1920s gave him a lot of low-hanging fruit. Krakauer claimed that Ellen's sacrifice derived from Dostoevsky's notion of the noblest man being the one who suffers not for himself, but for his fellow men. And Krakauer went on to say that Dostoevsky's widespread popularity among the German middle class was itself tied to the rise of Nazism. The German editor of Dostoevsky's books, Müller-Vanderbroek, came up with the concept and terminology of the Third Reich. Krakauer said this concept of noble self-sacrifice smacked of what he called the middle class's aversion to social and political change. A terrible tyrant could rise, and the citizens would passively accept their lot because to suffer nobly under the tyrant was preferable to messy revolution and resistance. I don't see it that way at all. Ellen is not a passive victim. Read her sacrifice in Christian terms if you choose. She dies so that we might live. Sure. But her death genuinely does bring about social change. If Count Orlok is a pre-Hitlerian tyrant, this woman brings him down. Tell me that's not a political reading. The conventional authorities of the state are useless and ineffective, while it is up to the citizens, good-hearted people who keep their eyes open and aren't afraid of making tough choices to keep the monsters at bay. So, let's bring this all together, shall we? It starts with Bram Stoker, a Victorian Englishman living a life of considerable sexual anxiety, who translates his private apprehension into a work of literature that has stood the test of time. Dracula was then seized upon by a community of occultists for whom it was more than just fiction, but a popularization of the secret mysteries of life. One of the occultists, Alban Grau, happened to be a designer on the periphery of the film industry, and he was so enervated by the idea of making a film adaptation that he founded a movie company and hired F.W. Murnau. Murnau, in turn, was a visionary artist of uncommon abilities, who along with Grau staffed Nosferatu with actors and technicians all at the top of their game. They brought so much talent to bear on the production that even though it is stylistically hardly representative of German silent cinema, it has nevertheless been accepted as one of the signature keystones of the entire era. Their work was outside the law, however, and the estate of Bram Stoker sued. In every single court that Stoker's widow brought her claims, the law sided with her and ruled against Nosferatu. Yet despite a succession of court orders mandating the destruction of the film, it has survived to this day, ceding its influence on all who see it. At times, the commercial value of Nosferatu was negligible. It was given away for free, or for $400, which is pretty close to free in Hollywood money. But its value has never been properly assessed in purely commercial terms. Stoker's claims be damned, no one but her wanted to see this thing destroyed. For the last 94 minutes, I have repeatedly invoked the phrase improbably survived to the present day, but there is an answer to that riddle. Nosferatu survived because it is good. Uncommonly, profoundly, undeniably good. And oh boy, have I enjoyed watching it with you. I'm David Callett. Thank you for your attention.